There are some acts of resistance so precise, so calculated, that they blur the line between mercy and murder. In the winter of 1943, inside a military hospital in occupied Poland, a young nurse named Janina Nowak walked the sterile corridors with a secret that could have ended her life in seconds. She wasn't smuggling weapons. She wasn't hiding Jews in the basement. What she was doing was far more insidious, far more personal. Every time an SS officer was wheeled into her ward, bleeding from the Eastern Front, she would check his blood type, nod professionally, and then deliberately give him the wrong one. Type A received Type B. Type O received Type AB. The results were always the same: confusion, convulsions, and within hours, death. The Nazis called it battlefield complications. Janina called it justice. By the time the war ended, she had killed an estimated 23 SS officers, one transfusion at a time, and no one ever suspected the quiet girl with the perfect attendance record. This is the story they erased from history books, the kind of resistance that makes people uncomfortable because it forces us to ask a question we'd rather avoid. When does a healer become an executioner? The promise I'm making to you right now is simple. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what Janina did, but why the world forgot her, why her method was so devastatingly effective, and why her story reveals a truth about occupied Europe that Hollywood has never dared to touch. You'll see the war through the eyes of someone who had no gun, no rank, no army behind her, just a nurse's uniform and a knowledge of human blood that she turned into a weapon. This isn't a story about heroes charging into battle. This is about something quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Poland in 1943 was a graveyard with a pulse. The Nazis had occupied the country for nearly 4 years, and Warsaw, once a city of light and culture, had become a machine designed to crush the human spirit. The Jewish ghetto had been liquidated. The resistance was being hunted street by street. And in the center of this nightmare sat the Wehrmacht hospital, a sprawling complex where German soldiers were patched up and sent back to the front. The building itself was a monument to efficiency, 3 floors of white walls and the smell of disinfectant, where Polish nurses worked under the constant supervision of German doctors. These women had been carefully selected, young, fluent in German, and most importantly, trained in modern medical techniques. The Nazis trusted them because they needed them. Battlefield medicine required speed, and speed required local staff who knew the layout, the supplies, the systems. It was a calculated risk, and for 3 years, it had worked perfectly. Janina Nowak was 24 years old when she started working at the hospital in the summer of 1942. On paper, she was unremarkable. She had graduated from nursing school in Warsaw just before the invasion, had no criminal record, no ties to known resistance groups, and came from a family of minor civil servants who had learned to keep their heads down. Her German was flawless, her handwriting neat, and her demeanor exactly what the occupiers wanted: polite, efficient, forgettable. She worked the night shift in the surgical recovery ward, the place where soldiers woke up from operations, disoriented and vulnerable. It was here, in the dim light of those overnight hours, that she had access to something most resistance fighters would have killed for: complete control over who lived and who died. The hospital kept meticulous records of blood types for every patient, stored in files at each bedside. Standard procedure dictated that nurses double-check the type before administering any transfusion, a safety measure designed to prevent exactly the kind of mistake Janina was about to weaponize. The mechanics of what she did were brutally simple, and that was the genius of it. Human blood comes in 8 basic types, and mixing incompatible types triggers an immediate immune response. The body recognizes the foreign cells as invaders and attacks them, causing the red blood cells to clump together and burst. This triggers a cascade of failures. The kidneys shut down trying to filter the debris, the blood pressure drops, and within hours, the patient goes into shock. In a modern hospital with full diagnostic equipment, this might be caught in time. But in a war-torn facility in 1943, where hundreds of wounded men cycled through every week, where chaos was the baseline and death was expected, a transfusion reaction looked exactly like a dozen other battlefield complications. Infection, internal bleeding, delayed shock from trauma, the symptoms overlapped perfectly. And Janina knew this because she had been trained to recognize these reactions, trained to prevent them. Now she was engineering them, one careful switch at a time, in the darkest hours of the night when supervision was thinnest. She didn't start with SS officers. That detail is important because it reveals the calculation behind her method. For the first 6 months, Janina was the model employee, perfect attendance, 0 mistakes, consistently praised by the German head nurse for her attention to detail. She learned the rhythms of the hospital, who checked what and when, which doctors were lazy, which orderlies cut corners, where the gaps in the system existed. She studied the filing system until she could pull a patient record in the dark. She memorized the blood storage protocol, the refrigeration units, the labeling system, the chain of custody. And only when she was certain, only when she had mapped every variable and calculated every risk, did she make her first switch. It was January 19th, 1943, and the patient was an SS Sturmbannführer named Klaus Zimmermann, recuperating from a shrapnel wound to his abdomen. His chart said Type A. Janina gave him Type B. He was dead by morning. Cause of death listed as post-operative infection. The death of Klaus Zimmermann should have triggered an investigation, but it didn't, and that tells you everything you need to know about the chaos inside that hospital in the winter of 1943. The Eastern Front was collapsing in slow motion. Stalingrad had just fallen, and trainloads of wounded were flooding back into occupied Poland every single day. The hospital was processing 3 times its capacity, beds in hallways, operations performed in shifts around the clock, and the mortality rate was already climbing. One more dead officer, even an SS officer, was just a statistic in a building where statistics had lost all meaning. The German head doctor signed off on the infection diagnosis without a second glance, and Zimmermann's body was shipped back to Berlin in a sealed coffin. Janina watched the paperwork get filed, watched the chuang get stripped and remade for the next patient, and understood something fundamental. She had found a crack in the system wide enough to kill through, but she didn't rush. That's what separates her story from the romantic myths of resistance we usually hear. There were no impulsive acts of vengeance, no dramatic moments of defiance. Janina waited 7 weeks before her second kill, and this time she chose her target with surgical precision. His name was Heinrich Vogel, an SS Hauptsturmführer recovering from a bullet wound to the shoulder, a man whose file indicated he had served at Treblinka before being transferred to frontline duty. She learned this because she had started doing something incredibly dangerous. She was reading their files, really reading them, cross-referencing names with resistance intelligence that she gathered from whispered conversations in the staff bathroom, from newspapers left in the break room, from the gossip of other Polish nurses who knew things they weren't supposed to know. She was building a target list, prioritizing not just by rank but by crimes committed, and Vogel was at the top. His blood type was O positive. She gave him AB negative. He died screaming about fire in his veins, and the doctors diagnosed it as an allergic reaction to morphine. The pattern she established was meticulous, and it had to be. Janina never killed 2 patients in the same month. She never targeted anyone below the rank of Sturmbannführer, understanding instinctively that lower-ranking soldiers were less likely to trigger scrutiny, but also less symbolically valuable. She rotated her methods, sometimes switching blood during the initial transfusion, sometimes during a follow-up treatment days later, creating enough temporal distance that no one would connect the dots. She varied the blood type mismatches, never using the same incompatible combination twice in a row, because she understood that patterns are what investigators look for. And most importantly, she never told anyone. Not her family, not her fellow nurses, not even the resistance cells that operated in the hospital's basement, smuggling medicine to the partisans. This was her war, fought in absolute silence, and silence was the only thing keeping her alive. The psychological weight of what she was doing is almost impossible to imagine. Every shift, Janina walked into that hospital knowing she was going to decide who lived and who died. She would tend to German soldiers with genuine care, changing their bandages, monitoring their pain levels, holding their hands when they were afraid, and then, for the ones she had marked, she would kill them with the same hands that had just offered comfort. There was no visible hatred, no moment where the mask slipped. She smiled at the German doctors, shared cigarettes with the Wehrmacht nurses, celebrated when the hospital received a shipment of fresh plasma. She attended Mass every Sunday at the Catholic church 2 blocks from her apartment, and the priest would later say she seemed troubled but faithful, a young woman coping with the horrors of war the way everyone else was, through prayer and routine. No one suspected that she was confessing murders she had no intention of stopping. By the summer of 1943, Janina had killed 9 SS officers, and the hospital administration was finally starting to notice something was wrong. Not the pattern, not yet, but the numbers. The mortality rate in the surgical recovery ward was 0.7% higher than it should have been, a tiny statistical anomaly that would have been ignored in any other context, but was now flagged because Berlin was demanding efficiency reports. A German auditor arrived in July, a meticulous bureaucrat named Reinhardt, who spent 2 weeks reviewing every death in the previous 6 months. He interviewed nurses, examined supply logs, checked the refrigeration temperatures of the blood storage units. He came within inches of discovering what Janina had done, actually pulled the files of 3 of her victims and laid them side by side on his desk, noting that all 3 had died of similar symptoms. But then he made a mistake that saved her life. He assumed the problem was contaminated plasma from a bad batch, not deliberate sabotage. The hospital switched suppliers, installed new quality control measures, and Reinhardt returned to Berlin satisfied he had solved the mystery. Janina read his report in the administrative office where it was filed, and she understood that her window was closing, that the next anomaly wouldn't be explained away so easily. She had a choice to make: stop now and survive, or continue, and accept that eventually, inevitably, she would be caught. Janina chose to continue, and the reason why reveals something essential about the nature of resistance under occupation. It wasn't ideology that drove her forward, at least not in the way we typically understand it. She wasn't a communist, wasn't part of the Home Army, hadn't sworn any oaths to underground organizations. What she had was something more primal, a mathematical certainty that every SS officer she killed meant fewer executions in the streets, fewer deportations to the camps, fewer Polish families destroyed. She had watched these men recover in her ward, had heard them brag about their work when they thought the Polish staff couldn't understand German. She had cleaned the boots of an Obersturmführer who casually mentioned burning a village of 200 people because someone had shot at his convoy. She had changed the bandages of a Hauptsturmführer who kept a leather notebook filled with photographs of hangings he had personally supervised. These weren't soldiers fighting a war. These were architects of extermination, and every single one who walked out of that hospital alive would return to the machinery of genocide. Janina did the math, and the math told her that her own life was a reasonable price to pay for even a few more deaths on her ledger. So she adapted her method, made it even more sophisticated. Instead of targeting patients immediately after surgery, when they were already vulnerable and deaths were expected, she started waiting until they were almost recovered, until they were scheduled for discharge within days. The logic was ruthless but sound. A patient who dies on day 2 of recovery is a surgical complication, but a patient who dies on day 12 after showing steady improvement, after being cleared by multiple doctors, that looked like bad luck, not malpractice. She began keeping a secondary set of notes hidden in her apartment, a coded journal where she tracked her targets, their crimes based on what she had overheard, their recovery progress, and the optimal window for intervention. The codes she used were borrowed from her nursing school textbooks, medical terminology that would look like study notes if anyone ever found them. Under the entry for August 9, 1943, she wrote, "Patient exhibits accelerated hemolysis, recommend immediate intervention," which meant she had identified her next target and the timeline for his death. The hospital itself was changing in ways that both helped and hindered her work. The influx of wounded from the Eastern Front had slowed as the Wehrmacht went on the defensive, which meant fewer patients overall, but more scrutiny on each individual case. The German medical staff, previously stretched so thin they barely noticed what the Polish nurses were doing, now had time to review charts, to ask questions, to double-check procedures. Janina compensated by becoming even more indispensable. volunteering for extra shifts, taking on the most difficult patients, the ones with complicated injuries that required constant monitoring. She made herself the nurse that doctors requested by name, the one they trusted implicitly because she had never ever made a visible mistake. This trust was her camouflage, and she wore it perfectly, even as she used it to kill. Her 11th victim was an SS Sturmbannführer named Otto Lindemann, a man who had served as a camp administrator at Majdanek before being wounded in a partisan ambush. His file indicated he was responsible for logistics, which in the language of the camps meant he had organized the transportation and disposal of thousands of bodies. Janina learned this from a resistance courier who worked in the hospital laundry, a woman who had access to intelligence networks and whispered the information during a shift change. Lindemann was a model patient, polite to the staff, grateful for the care, and he spoke about his wife and children with genuine affection. He showed Janina photographs from his wallet, 2 young boys in lederhosen, smiling in a garden somewhere in Bavaria. She looked at those photographs, nodded politely, and then that night she switched his blood from type A to type B during what was supposed to be a routine iron supplement transfusion. He died 36 hours later, and the official cause was listed as unexpected cardiac arrest, a tragic but not uncommon complication in recovering trauma patients. The killing of Lindemann marked a turning point because it was the first time Janina felt something close to doubt. Not moral doubt, she had made peace with what she was doing, but tactical doubt. The hospital had installed a new protocol after the auditor's visit. All transfusions now required a second nurse to verify the blood type before administration, a buddy system designed to catch exactly the kind of error she was engineering. This should have ended her operation entirely, but instead it revealed just how deep the cracks in the occupation system ran. The second nurse assigned to verify her work was a Polish woman named Christina, 20 years older, who had worked at the hospital since before the war. Christina never asked questions, never double-checked Janina's work, simply signed the verification forms and moved on to the next task. It took Janina 3 weeks to realize the truth. Christina knew exactly what she was doing and had chosen to look the other way. They never spoke about it directly, never acknowledged the silent conspiracy between them, but from that point forward, Janina had an accomplice whether she wanted one or not. The presence of Christina changed the mathematics of risk in ways Janina hadn't anticipated. On one hand, it meant she was no longer operating in complete isolation, that someone else knew or at least suspected what she was doing, and that knowledge was a vulnerability. Christina could be arrested, could be tortured, could give her up under interrogation, either deliberately or accidentally. But on the other hand, it meant Janina now had cover at the most critical moment of her operation, the verification step where she was most exposed. Christina's signatures on those forms were insurance, evidence that proper protocol had been followed, that 2 trained nurses had confirmed the blood type match. If an investigation ever happened, those signatures would deflect suspicion away from deliberate sabotage and towards systemic failure, bad labeling, contaminated storage, human error at scale. Janina understood this implicitly, and so she continued, but now with a strange sense of shared burden, knowing that somewhere in the building was another Polish woman who had also decided that some Germans deserved to die, and that the rules of medicine didn't apply to monsters. The autumn of 1943 brought a new category of patient to the hospital, and with them, a new level of moral complexity that Janina hadn't prepared for. These were the Waffen-SS combat veterans, men who had been pulled from the regular Wehrmacht and folded into the ideological elite, and unlike the camp administrators and occupation police she had been targeting, these soldiers had actually fought. They came in with horrific injuries from the Eastern Front, legs blown off by Soviet artillery, faces burned beyond recognition, bodies broken in ways that made her nursing training feel inadequate. Some of them were barely 20 years old, teenagers really, who had been recruited straight from the Hitler Youth and thrown into combat before they understood what war actually meant. Janina found herself in an impossible position. She could hear these young men crying for their mothers in the night, could see the terror in their eyes when they realized they would never walk again, and yet she also knew that the SS uniform they wore represented a voluntary choice to join the most murderous organization in human history. She developed a system for navigating this moral labyrinth, and it was coldly pragmatic. Age didn't matter. Injuries didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what they had done before they ended up in her ward. She started spending her breaks in the hospital's administrative office, volunteering to help with filing, which gave her access to the personnel records that came with each patient. These files contained their full service history, every unit they had served with, every operation they had participated in, and Janina learned to read between the lines. A soldier who had served with the Totenkopf division at Demyansk wasn't just a combat veteran. He was someone who had participated in anti-partisan operations that were really just mass executions of civilians. A man who had been stationed in Ukraine with the 1st SS Panzer Division hadn't just fought the Red Army. He had been part of the Einsatzgruppen sweeps that left entire villages erased from existence. These were the ones she marked, regardless of their age, regardless of how broken their bodies were. Her 13th kill was a 19-year-old Rottenführer named Hans Becker, who looked like he should have been in a university lecture hall instead of a hospital bed. He had lost his right arm to a grenade in Belarus and was recovering well, cheerful even, telling jokes to the other patients and flirting harmlessly with the nurses. His file showed he had served with SS Sturmbrigade Dirlewanger, a unit so notorious for atrocities that even other SS officers refused to work with them. Becker had been with them during the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, had been part of the units that went building to building burning families alive. Janina read this information, closed the file and returned to his bedside where he smiled at her and asked if she thought he would be able to play piano again with one arm. She told him she believed in miracles, scheduled a routine blood transfusion to address his anemia, and gave him type AB when his chart clearly stated type O. He died confused and afraid, his body rejecting the foreign blood with a violence that no amount of morphine could ease, and Janina held his remaining hand and told him everything would be fine until his heart finally stopped. The psychological toll of these killings was beginning to show in ways she couldn't completely control. She stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night. Her hands developed a tremor that she had to consciously suppress during procedures, and she lost nearly 10 kilograms over the course of 3 months. The other nurses noticed, but attributed it to the stress of wartime work, the malnutrition that was affecting everyone in occupied Poland, the emotional exhaustion of watching young men die every day. Nobody suspected the truth, that Janina was being consumed not by the deaths she witnessed, but by the deaths she caused, that every night when she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the men she had killed, and that unlike the resistance fighters who could tell themselves they were soldiers in a war, she had no such comfort, because what she was doing violated every principle of the profession she had chosen, perverted the fundamental oath to do no harm into something unrecognizable and necessary and utterly unforgivable. By the winter of 1943, Janina had developed what intelligence operatives would recognize as a professional detachment, a psychological compartmentalization that allowed her to function in 2 completely contradictory realities simultaneously. During her shifts, she was the perfect nurse, attentive and compassionate, advocating for her patients' comfort, arguing with doctors about pain management, staying late to sit with soldiers who were afraid of dying alone. But underneath that performance was a constant calculation, a running assessment of every SS officer who came through the doors, evaluating their files, their histories, their eligibility for her particular form of justice. She had killed 17 men by this point, and the methodology had become so refined, so embedded in her routine, that it required almost no conscious effort. The switches happened in moments of controlled chaos, during shift changes, when 2 nursing teams overlapped, during emergency admissions when the surgery ward was flooded with new casualties, in the pre-dawn hours when exhaustion made people careless and supervision became theoretical. The hospital had become a different place as the war turned against Germany. The optimism that had characterized the early occupation, the arrogant certainty of German invincibility, had curdled into something darker and more desperate. Officers no longer spoke about victory timelines. They spoke about holding positions, strategic withdrawals, necessary sacrifices. The photographs that used to circulate among the staff, images of German soldiers posing in front of conquered Soviet cities, had been replaced by letters from the front describing conditions that sounded apocalyptic: endless winter, no supplies, entire divisions disappearing into the Russian vastness. This desperation manifested in the hospital as a kind of institutional paranoia. The Gestapo started making random inspections, looking for sabotage, for black market activity, for any sign that the Polish staff was undermining the occupation. Twice in December alone, nurses were arrested on suspicion of stealing morphine for the resistance, and both times the women simply disappeared. No trial, no explanation, just empty beds in the staff dormitory and whispered rumors about what happened to people who ended up in Pawiak prison. Janina understood that her operation was living on borrowed time, that the Gestapo's increased presence meant discovery was no longer a question of if, but when. She started preparing for the endgame, destroying her coded journal page by page, burning each entry in the small stove in her apartment and scattering the ashes. She stopped keeping any written records at all, committing everything to memory instead: the names of her victims, their crimes, the dates of their deaths. She began distancing herself from the other Polish nurses, declining invitations to socialize, avoiding the conversations in the staff bathroom where resistance information was whispered, creating a deliberate isolation that would protect others if she was caught. She even considered stopping entirely, walking away while she was still free. But every time she seriously entertained the idea, another SS officer would arrive in her ward, another file would reveal another atrocity, and the decision would make itself. Her 18th victim arrived on January 7, 1944, and he was different from all the others, in a way that made Janina question whether she had finally found the limit of what she was capable of. His name was Friedrich Hoffmann, an SS Obersturmbannführer who had been serving as a commandant at Plaszow concentration camp before being critically wounded in a partisan attack. His injuries were catastrophic: multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, and the surgeons who operated on him gave him less than a 20% chance of survival. He should have died on the operating table, but somehow he didn't. And over the following weeks he staged a recovery that the German doctors called miraculous. Hoffmann was conscious, alert, and unlike most of the SS officers who passed through the ward, he was educated and articulate, a former university professor who quoted Goethe and discussed philosophy with anyone who would listen. He treated the Polish nurses with a courtesy that bordered on respect, said please and thank you, never made crude remarks or issued orders like they were servants. But Janina had read his file, had seen the documentation of what he had overseen at Plaszow, the systematic murder of thousands of Jews, the selection processes, the arbitrary executions, the medical experiments. She had learned from resistance sources that Hoffmann had personally shot children in front of their parents as a method of maintaining discipline in the camp. And so when he smiled at her and complimented her skill with an IV line, when he asked about her life and seemed genuinely interested in her answer, she smiled back and began planning his death with the same methodical precision she had applied to all the others. The cognitive dissonance of this, the ability to engage in what felt like authentic human connection with someone she intended to kill, revealed something about the occupation that Janina had learned but never articulated. The Nazis were not monsters in the fairy tale sense, not creatures fundamentally different from other humans. They were people, ordinary people, who had chosen to participate in extraordinary evil, and that ordinariness made them more terrifying, not less, because it meant the capacity for this kind of systematic cruelty existed in everyone, including herself. The killing of Friedrich Hoffmann required more planning than any of her previous operations, because he was too important to die quietly. As a camp commandant, his medical care was being monitored directly by officials in Berlin, with weekly reports sent to the SS Medical Administration detailing his condition and prognosis. A sudden death from transfusion complications would trigger exactly the kind of investigation Janina had spent 2 years avoiding, complete with autopsies, toxicology reports, and interviews with every staff member who had contact with him. She needed his death to look not just natural but inevitable, a tragic outcome of injuries that had been too severe from the beginning. So she did something she had never done before. She waited. For 3 weeks she provided Hoffman with impeccable care, monitoring his vitals obsessively, catching complications before they became critical, essentially keeping him alive longer than he would have survived without her intervention, all while documenting every detail in his chart to establish a pattern of declining health despite best efforts. The method she eventually chose was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its patience. Hoffman's injuries had caused significant internal trauma, and his recovery required multiple blood transfusions over an extended period to address ongoing anemia. Janina began administering incompatible blood in small quantities, not enough to trigger an immediate catastrophic reaction, but enough to cause cumulative damage to his kidneys and liver. Type A blood mixed carefully with Type B, just 20 milliliters at a time, hidden within the larger volume of compatible transfusions. His body was essentially being poisoned incrementally, his organs slowly failing under the strain of processing the foreign blood cells, but the decline was gradual enough that it looked like the expected trajectory of someone with his level of trauma. The German doctors noted the deteriorating kidney function, the elevated liver enzymes, the unexplained fevers, and attributed everything to systemic infection, a common complication in patients with multiple penetrating wounds. During those 3 weeks, Janina had conversations with Hoffman that she would remember for the rest of her life, not because they were profound, but because of their absolute banality. He told her about his 2 daughters in Munich, showed her a creased photograph of them playing in a park, worried aloud about how the war was affecting their education. He talked about his previous life as a professor of classical literature, his dissertation on Virgil, his love of teaching young minds. He asked Janina about her own family, whether she had siblings, what she had wanted to be before the war disrupted everything. These conversations happened while she was slowly killing him, while the incompatible blood she had given him hours earlier was destroying his kidneys cell by cell, and she engaged with complete authenticity, asking follow-up questions, sharing carefully edited details of her own life, creating the illusion of genuine human connection while administering death in measured doses. The contradiction between who Hoffman appeared to be in those conversations and what he had actually done at Plasov forced Janina to confront a truth about evil that most people never have to face directly. The man who quoted poetry and worried about his daughter's education was the same man who had shot children for sport, and these 2 realities existed simultaneously in the same person without any apparent internal conflict. Hoffman never expressed remorse, never hinted that he saw anything wrong with his service at the camp, and on the rare occasions when the subject of his work came up, he spoke about it with the detached professionalism of someone discussing administrative challenges, problems of logistics and efficiency that he had solved through innovative management techniques. Janina realized that he genuinely did not understand that he had done anything morally wrong, that in his internal narrative he was a loyal officer serving his country. And this realization was more disturbing than any amount of obvious cruelty would have been because it revealed the psychological mechanism that made the Holocaust possible. Ordinary people convinced that extraordinary evil was just another job. Hoffman died on February 3, 1944, after slipping into a coma caused by complete renal failure. The German doctors performed an autopsy that found exactly what Janina had predicted they would find: massive organ damage consistent with systemic infection and traumatic injury. The cause of death was listed as septic shock secondary to combat wounds, and a report was sent to Berlin, praising the hospital staff for their heroic efforts to save a valuable officer. Hoffman's body was shipped back to Germany with full military honors, and his widow received a letter from Heinrich Himmler personally commending her husband's service to the Reich. Nobody suspected murder, because the death looked exactly like what everyone expected: another casualty of a war that was consuming Germany's best men. Janina attended the small memorial service the hospital held for him, stood quietly in the back while German officers gave speeches about sacrifice and duty, and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction, just a blank exhaustion that came from maintaining a performance that had no end in sight. The spring of 1944 brought a shift in the hospital's atmosphere that even the most oblivious German officers couldn't ignore. The Soviet offensive was accelerating, pushing westward through Ukraine and Belarus, and the wounded flooding back into Poland now came with stories that contradicted every piece of propaganda the Reich had been broadcasting. These were men who had seen entire divisions annihilated, who described Soviet artillery barrages that lasted for days without pause, who spoke in whispers about German units surrendering en masse rather than face encirclement. The hospital was processing casualties at a rate that exceeded even the worst days of Stalingrad, and the medical staff was being pushed beyond any reasonable limit. Nurses were working 16-hour shifts, surgeries were being performed in hallways, and the morgue in the basement had run out of space weeks ago. In this chaos, Janina found both opportunity and danger, because while the breakdown of normal procedures gave her more freedom to operate, it also meant more scrutiny from SS security officers who were convinced that saboteurs were everywhere. Her 19th and 20th victims came within days of each other in mid-March, a dangerous acceleration of her usual pattern, but the circumstances were too perfect to ignore. Both men were SS Hauptsturmführer who had served together in the Einsatzgruppen sweeps through Lithuania, and their files documented participation in massacres that had killed tens of thousands of Jews. They had been wounded in the same engagement, shipped to the hospital together, and were recovering in adjacent beds, creating a situation where Janina could eliminate both with a single operation. She waited until a night when the hospital admitted 43 new casualties from a field hospital evacuation, a moment of such complete chaos that even the German supervising nurses abandoned protocol and simply tried to keep people alive. During that madness, Janina administered incompatible transfusions to both officers within 20 minutes of each other. Type O to the one who needed Type A, Type B to the one who needed Type AB, and then moved on to help with the emergency admissions as if nothing had happened. Both men died within hours of each other, their bodies going into shock almost simultaneously. And the timing actually worked in Janina's favor because it suggested a systemic problem rather than individual malpractice. The German head doctor launched an immediate investigation, convinced that a batch of blood had been contaminated, and spent 2 weeks testing every unit in storage, interviewing suppliers, reviewing refrigeration logs. The investigation found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The blood itself was fine, but the doctor's report concluded that quality control had failed somewhere in the supply chain, and ordered new protocols that ironically made Janina's work even easier, because now every transfusion required such extensive documentation that the sheer volume of paperwork created gaps that she could exploit. The deaths were ruled accidental. The families received apologetic letters from the hospital administration, and Janina added 2 more names to the list she kept only in her memory. But the double killing had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Christina, the older nurse who had been silently covering for her, approached her 3 days later in the staff bathroom, the only place in the hospital where they could talk without being overheard. She didn't ask Janina directly about what had happened, didn't acknowledge anything explicitly, but she said something that made Janina's blood run cold. "They're watching the Polish nurses more carefully now, checking our work, reviewing our shifts. Whatever you're doing, you need to stop, because the next time something goes wrong, they won't investigate the blood supply, they'll investigate us." It was the only direct conversation they ever had about Janina's operation, and it ended with Christina walking out of the bathroom without waiting for a response, leaving Janina alone with the certainty that her window of invisibility was closing faster than she had calculated. The warning should have been enough to make her stop, but in April of 1944, something happened that made stopping impossible. A new patient arrived in the surgical ward, an SS Standartenführer named Victor Brandt, who was recovering from injuries sustained during the suppression of a partisan attack. Janina processed his admission paperwork, filed his records, and then froze when she saw the notation of his previous posting. He had been the administrative head of operations at Treblinka from 1942 to 1943, the period when the camp had murdered nearly 900,000 people. She had read about Treblinka in the underground newspapers that circulated among the resistance, had seen the testimonies from the handful of prisoners who had escaped, had tried to comprehend the industrial scale of the killing, and failed because the human mind isn't built to process that level of atrocity. And now one of the architects of that machinery was lying in a bed 15 meters from where she stood, recovering comfortably, joking with the orderlies about how he couldn't wait to get back to his desk job, as if his desk job hadn't been the coordination of mass murder on a scale that made the ancient conquerors look like amateurs. Victor Brandt represented everything Janina had been fighting against, compressed into a single human being, and the opportunity to kill him felt less like a choice and more like a moral imperative that overrode every rational consideration of risk. His injuries were relatively minor compared to most patients, shrapnel wounds to the leg and torso that required surgery but weren't life-threatening, which meant he would recover quickly and return to whatever administrative role the SS had planned for him next. Janina understood that if she was going to act, she had a narrow window, perhaps 2 weeks at most, before he was discharged and sent back to Berlin where he would be untouchable. But Brandt's high rank meant his care was being monitored even more closely than Hoffmann's had been, with daily reports sent directly to SS headquarters and regular visits from security officers who seemed to be assessing the hospital staff as much as checking on the patient. Every nurse who entered his room was scrutinized, every procedure documented in duplicate, and the level of oversight made what Janina was planning essentially suicidal. She spent 5 days observing the patterns of surveillance around Brandt, mapping who checked on him and when, identifying the brief gaps in coverage that existed even in the most controlled environments. The vulnerability she found was almost absurdly simple. The night shift security officer, a Wehrmacht lieutenant named Schmidt, who was responsible for checking on high-value patients every 2 hours, had developed a habit of taking his rounds 15 minutes early so he could spend the last part of his shift smoking in the courtyard. This created a window between 2:15 and 3:30 in the morning when Brandt was technically unsupervised, and if Janina timed it perfectly, she could administer the transfusion, complete the paperwork, and be back at the nurse's station before Schmidt finished his cigarette. The plan required precision that bordered on the impossible, but the alternative was letting Brandt walk out of the hospital alive, and that wasn't something Janina could accept. On the night of April 23rd, she executed the operation with a calmness that surprised even herself. At 2:17 in the morning, she entered Brandt's room carrying a bag of type AB blood when his chart clearly indicated type O negative. He was awake, reading a book by the dim light above his bed, and he smiled when he saw her, made a comment about how dedicated she was to work such terrible hours. Janina smiled back, told him this would help with his recovery, and inserted the IV line with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. Brandt barely flinched, returned to his book, and Janina stood there for a moment watching the incompatible blood flow into his veins, watching him turn the pages of his book, completely unaware that he was dying, and she felt a strange sense of peace that had been absent from all her previous killings. This wasn't complicated. This wasn't morally ambiguous. This was removing a plague from the world, and if it cost her everything, it was still worth it. The reaction started faster than she had anticipated, Brandt's body recognizing the foreign blood almost immediately and mounting a catastrophic immune response. Within 20 minutes he was gasping for air, his skin flushing red as his blood pressure spiked, his hands clutching at his chest as the pain intensified. He tried to call for help, but his voice came out as a rasp, tried to reach for the call button, but his muscles were seizing, and Janina stood at the foot of his bed watching with clinical detachment as his body shut down system by system. She should have left immediately, should have returned to the nurse's station and established her alibi, but instead she stayed, and when Brandt's eyes found hers in those final moments, when he realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't an accident, that the Polish nurse standing calmly at the foot of his bed had deliberately killed him, Janina leaned forward and whispered in perfect German, "This is for Treblinka." His eyes widened in understanding, and then the light went out of them entirely. The decision to speak those words was the first genuine mistake Janina had made in 2 years of killing, a moment of emotional indulgence that violated every principle of operational security she had established. If Brandt had survived even 30 more seconds, if he had managed to communicate what had happened to anyone, Janina would have been arrested immediately. But his heart stopped before he could move, before he could make a sound. and he died with the knowledge that he had been murdered, but no ability to share that knowledge with anyone. Janina stood there for another 15 seconds, watching to make sure he was truly gone, then calmly removed the IV line, disposed of the blood bag in the medical waste bin exactly as protocol required, and returned to the nurse's station, where she documented the transfusion in Brandt's chart with her usual meticulous handwriting. She noted the time as 2:38, described the procedure as routine, and signed her name at the bottom of the page. 20 minutes later, an orderly found Brandt's body and raised the alarm, and Janina joined the crowd of staff that rushed to his room, performed the expected checks, and confirmed what everyone could see. The patient had died suddenly, cause unknown, a tragedy but not unexpected given the unpredictable nature of war injuries. The death of Victor Brandt triggered exactly the kind of investigation Janina had always known would eventually come, but the form it took was worse than anything she had imagined. Within 12 hours of his death, 2 Gestapo officers arrived at the hospital accompanied by an SS medical examiner from Berlin, and they immediately sealed off the surgical ward and began interrogating every staff member who had been on duty that night. The interrogations weren't the perfunctory interviews Janina had seen before, polite questions asked by Wehrmacht administrators who were going through the motions. These were methodical, aggressive sessions conducted in isolated rooms where the Gestapo officers made it clear they suspected deliberate murder and were prepared to arrest anyone who showed the slightest inconsistency in their testimony. Janina was questioned for 3 hours, asked to recount every detail of her shift, every patient she had treated, every procedure she had performed, and she repeated her story with the kind of exhausted precision that comes from telling the truth, because the best lies are built on foundations of verifiable fact. The medical examiner performed an autopsy that revealed what Janina had known he would find: massive hemolytic reaction consistent with transfusion of incompatible blood. The discovery transformed the investigation from a routine inquiry into a full counterintelligence operation. Because incompatible transfusions don't happen by accident in hospitals, with the protocols this facility had implemented after the previous audit. The Gestapo officers began working backwards through every death in the surgical ward for the previous 18 months, cross-referencing patient records with blood bank logs, interviewing nurses about their procedures, looking for patterns that would indicate sabotage. Janina watched this investigation unfold with a terror she had never experienced during the actual killings, because she understood that if they analyzed the data correctly, if they compared her shift schedules with the timing of suspicious deaths, they would find a correlation that could only mean one thing. But the investigation was saved from that conclusion by the chaos of war and the fundamental dysfunction of the Nazi bureaucratic system. The hospital's record-keeping, which had seemed so meticulous on the surface, turned out to be riddled with gaps and inconsistencies because the staff had been overwhelmed for years and had been cutting corners just to keep up with the volume of casualties. Blood bank logs were incomplete, shift schedules had been amended retroactively to cover staffing shortages, and patient files were missing entire sections because documents had been lost during evacuations or emergency admissions. When the Gestapo officers tried to construct a timeline of suspicious deaths, they found that the data was too fragmentary to establish any definitive patterns, and without those patterns, they couldn't identify a specific suspect. The investigation became an exercise in frustration. Dozens of hours of interrogations that produced no actionable intelligence, just a building full of exhausted Polish nurses who all told the same story. They had followed protocol, they had double-checked the blood types, and if mistakes had been made, they were the result of a system pushed beyond its breaking point, not deliberate sabotage. After 3 weeks, the Gestapo investigation reached a conclusion that was both a relief and a bitter irony. The officers determined that the incompatible transfusion that killed Brandt had been caused by mislabeling at the blood storage facility, a systemic failure in the supply chain rather than malicious action by hospital staff. They arrested 2 Polish workers at the blood bank, men who had nothing to do with Janina's operation, but who made convenient scapegoats, and both were executed after a show trial that lasted less than a day. The hospital received new directives about blood handling procedures. The remaining Polish staff were placed under increased surveillance, and the matter was considered closed. Janina watched those two innocent men get blamed for her work, watched them marched out of the building in chains, while German officers congratulated themselves on rooting out saboteurs, and she felt a guilt that was qualitatively different from anything the actual killings had produced. Because this was collateral damage, innocent blood spilled as a consequence of her actions, and there was no way to rationalize it as justified. The executions of the blood bank workers marked the end of Janina's operation, not because she made a conscious decision to stop, but because continuing had become impossible. The new surveillance protocols meant that every transfusion now required approval from a German supervising physician. Every blood bag was tracked from storage to disposal with a paper trail that couldn't be manipulated, and the Polish nursing staff was working under the constant observation of Gestapo informants who had been embedded in the hospital specifically to watch for sabotage. Janina had killed 21 SS officers over the course of 2 years, and now the machinery that had enabled those killings had been dismantled, not because anyone had discovered what she had done, but because the investigation into Brandt's death had tightened the system to the point where the gaps she had exploited no longer existed. She continued working at the hospital through the summer of 1944, providing genuine care to the endless stream of wounded German soldiers, and every day she walked past the memorial plaque the hospital had installed for Victor Brandt, a small brass rectangle that called him a hero of the Reich, and she felt nothing at all. The story of what happened to Janina Nowak after the war is where this entire narrative reveals its most disturbing truth about how history gets written and who gets remembered. When the Soviet army liberated Warsaw in January of 1945, Janina was still working at the hospital, still treating wounded soldiers, though by that point they were German casualties from the desperate fighting as the Wehrmacht tried to hold Poland against the advancing Red Army. She survived the liberation, survived the chaotic weeks that followed as the city changed hands, and simply walked away from the hospital one morning in February without saying goodbye to anyone or leaving any forwarding information. She disappeared into the wreckage of post-war Poland, and for the next 40 years, she told absolutely no one what she had done. Not her husband, whom she married in 1947, not her children, not the communist authorities who were documenting resistance activities and would have celebrated her story as anti-fascist heroism. The reason for her silence reveals something essential about the psychological cost of what she had accomplished. Janina understood that what she had done, regardless of the justification, had transformed her into something that couldn't be reconciled with normal civilian life. She had violated the fundamental ethics of her profession in the most deliberate way possible, had used medical knowledge as a weapon, had killed patients who trusted her with their care, and even though those patients were SS officers responsible for atrocities, even though her actions had probably saved lives by removing murderers from the field, she couldn't escape the fact that she had become a different kind of person than the young nursing student who had started working at that hospital in 1942. The war had given her a context where those killings made sense, where the moral calculus was clear enough to justify what she was doing, but peacetime offered no such clarity, just the knowledge that she had blood on her hands and a secret that would die with her. But secrets have a way of surviving even when the people who keep them don't, and Janina's story eventually emerged through the most mundane of circumstances. In 1986, a Polish historian researching the Warsaw hospital system during the occupation found Krystyna, the older nurse who had covered for Janina, still alive and living in a retirement home in Krakow. Krystyna was dying of cancer, had weeks left at most, and in those final days she decided that some stories were too important to take to the grave. She told the historian about a young nurse named Janina who had killed SS officers with transfusions, told him everything she had observed and suspected, provided dates and details that the historian was able to cross-reference with hospital records that had somehow survived the war. The historian tracked down Janina, who was by then 70 years old, living quietly in a small apartment in Warsaw, and confronted her with what Krystyna had revealed. Janina confirmed the story in a series of interviews conducted over 6 months, providing details that only the person who had actually done it could know, and the historian prepared to publish what he believed would be a groundbreaking account of resistance during the occupation. But when he submitted his research to academic journals, he encountered a resistance of a different kind. Editors were uncomfortable with the story, unsure how to frame a narrative about a nurse who had murdered patients, even when those patients were Nazis. Medical ethicists argued that publishing the story could undermine trust in healthcare workers. Jewish organizations were divided, some seeing Janina as a hero, others arguing that celebrating medical murder set a dangerous precedent regardless of the victim's crimes. The story was eventually published in a small Polish historical journal in 1989, was read by perhaps a few hundred academics, and then disappeared into the archives, deemed too morally complicated for popular consumption. Janina Nowak died in 1993 at the age of 77, having lived most of her life with a secret that the world decided it didn't want to hear. There are no memorials to her, no plaques on buildings, no mention of her in the standard histories of Polish resistance during World War II. The 21 SS officers she killed are recorded in German military archives as having died of combat wounds or medical complications. Their families received pensions, and some have descendants who still believe their grandfathers were heroes who fell defending Europe from Bolshevism. The two innocent men who were executed in her place have no graves, no records, just a notation in a Gestapo file that they were shot for sabotage. And the larger truth that Janina's story reveals, the truth that makes people so uncomfortable they would rather forget it entirely, is that resistance during occupation often required becoming the thing you were fighting against, that stopping monsters sometimes meant using monstrous methods, and that the people who were willing to cross that line, who sacrificed not just their lives but their souls to fight back, are the ones history has the hardest time acknowledging, because they force us to confront questions we would rather not answer, about what we would do in their position, and whether we would have the courage to become what Janina Nowak became. A healer who killed, a nurse who weaponized mercy, and a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to save lives is to take them, one careful transfusion at a time,